Picture this. A quiet girl walks into her classroom, completely unaware that her chair has been sabotaged with industrial-strength glue. The bullies are already recording, waiting for the perfect moment of humiliation. But what they don't know is that this shy newcomer has calloused hands from years of grappling on wrestling mats. And when she discovers their cruel prank, she's about to show them exactly what happens when you mess with a state champion who's been hiding in plain sight. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Emma Rodriguez pressed her face against the rain-streaked window of the Greyhound bus as it rolled through the winding roads of Cedar Falls, Oregon. The Pacific Northwest landscape was a stark contrast to the desert plains of Phoenix she'd left behind 3 weeks ago. Towering evergreens lined the highway like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with morning mist that seemed to cling to everything in this perpetually damp corner of the world. At 17, Emma had never imagined she'd be starting over in a place where the sun felt like a rare visitor and everyone seemed to know each other's business before breakfast. Her reflection in the window showed a girl who looked smaller than she actually was, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and brown eyes that held depths most people never bothered to explore. She wore a plain gray sweater and jeans that her mother had carefully selected from the clearance rack at Target, hoping they'd help Emma blend in at her new school. What her mother didn't realize was that Emma had spent the last 4 years learning that blending in was sometimes the safest strategy, even when you possess the kind of strength that could surprise people. The bus lurched to a stop at Riverside High School, a sprawling brick building that looked like it had been constructed sometime in the 1980s and forgotten about ever since. Students poured out of cars and other buses, their voices creating a symphony of teenage energy that felt both familiar and foreign to Emma. She shouldered her worn backpack, the same one she'd carried through 3 different schools in Phoenix, and took a deep breath that tasted of pine needles and possibility. Cedar Falls was supposed to be their fresh start. Her father had landed a job at Morrison Lumber Company after months of unemployment, and her mother had painted this move as an adventure, a chance to experience small-town life where people cared about each other and Friday night football games were community events. Emma wanted to believe in that vision, but she'd learned to be cautious about hope. Hope had a way of setting you up for disappointment, and at 17, she'd already collected enough disappointments to last a lifetime. Walking through the front doors of Riverside High felt like entering a different universe. The hallways were narrower than her old school, lined with trophy cases that celebrated decades of Raven pride. The smell of industrial cleaner mixed with teenage cologne and the faint aroma of whatever they were serving in the cafeteria. Emma clutched her schedule and locker combination, trying to navigate the maze of corridors while avoiding the curious stares that seemed to follow every new student like a spotlight. Her first period was American history with Mrs. Patterson, a woman who looked like she'd been teaching since the actual American Revolution. Emma slipped into a seat near the back, hoping to observe the social dynamics before making any moves. She'd learned this strategy the hard way in Phoenix, where walking into the wrong conversation or sitting at the wrong table could mark you as an outsider for months. The classroom filled with students who moved with the easy confidence of people who'd known each other since kindergarten. Emma watched them interact, noting the subtle hierarchies and alliances that existed in every high school but manifested differently depending on the ecosystem. There were the obvious athletes with their letterman jackets, the theater kids who spoke in dramatic whispers, and the academic overachievers who had their homework organized in color-coded folders. But it was during the transition between first and second period that Emma first noticed them. 3 girls moved through the hallway like they owned it, their perfectly styled hair and coordinated outfits creating a mobile fashion show that other students unconsciously stepped aside for. The blonde in the center, who Emma would later learn was Madison Parker, had the kind of confidence that could either inspire or intimidate, depending on which side of her attention you found yourself on. Madison's companions, Chloe and Ashley, flanked her like backup dancers in a music video, their movements synchronized in that way that only comes from years of friendship or careful choreography. They were beautiful in the way that high school queens always are, but there was something else in their eyes that Emma recognized immediately. It was the look of predators who'd learned to smile while they circled their prey. Emma made a mental note to stay off their radar, the same way she'd learned to avoid the popular girls in Phoenix. She discovered that the best strategy was to be invisible until you understood the rules of engagement. Some battles were worth fighting, but most were just distractions from bigger goals. She had plans that extended beyond high school drama, dreams that required her to keep her head down and her grades up. By third period, Emma had settled into a rhythm. She'd found her locker, figured out the layout of the building, and even managed to grab a decent seat in her advanced placement literature class. The teacher, Mr. Davidson, seemed like the kind of educator who actually cared about helping students think critically, rather than just memorizing facts for tests. Emma allowed herself a small smile as she took notes on the syllabus, thinking that maybe this year might be different. What she didn't know was that her careful observations had been noticed. Madison Parker had a talent for spotting new students, especially ones who might pose a threat to the carefully constructed social order she'd spent 3 years building. And something about the new girl, with the quiet confidence and the way she carried herself, suggested she might be more than she appeared. The cafeteria at Riverside High was a carefully orchestrated theater of teenage hierarchy, and Madison Parker knew her role perfectly. She glided through the lunch line with the kind of effortless grace that made other students unconsciously step aside, her blonde hair catching the fluorescent lights like spun gold. At 18, Madison had perfected the art of being simultaneously approachable and untouchable, a skill that had served her well since freshman year, when she'd first realized that popularity was less about being liked and more about being necessary. She surveyed the cafeteria with the practiced eye of a general reviewing troops. The jocks occupied their traditional territory near the windows, their voices carrying across the room as they debated weekend plans and upcoming games. The theater kids had claimed the tables closest to the stage area, their animated conversations punctuated by spontaneous bursts of song or dramatic gestures. The academic achievers huddled over textbooks and laptops, their stress levels visible in the way they hunched over their work like they were protecting state secrets. And then there were the invisible ones, the students who moved through the school like ghosts, hoping to avoid attention until graduation set them free. Madison had learned early that these were often the most interesting people in any school, hiding depths and stories that could prove useful in the right circumstances. The trick was knowing which ones were worth her time and which ones were simply taking up space. Her companions, Chloe Bennett and Ashley Cruz, had been with her since middle school, their friendship forged in the crucible of adolescent social warfare. Chloe, with her auburn hair and sharp wit, served as Madison's intelligence officer, collecting information about students, teachers, and school politics with the efficiency of a seasoned spy. Ashley, whose Latina heritage gave her access to different social circles, was the enforcer, capable of delivering cutting remarks with surgical precision or offering seemingly innocent compliments that left their targets questioning everything about themselves. Together, they formed what the rest of the student body had dubbed the Royals, a nickname that Madison neither encouraged nor discouraged. She understood that mystique was more powerful than explanation, and allowing others to create narratives about her power only enhanced her influence. Teachers treated her with a mixture of respect and wariness, recognizing that she could make their classroom dynamics either smooth or turbulent, depending on her mood. Parents whispered about her at PTA meetings, simultaneously admiring her confidence and worrying about her influence on their own children. The power Madison wielded wasn't built on fear alone, though fear certainly played a role. She'd cultivated a reputation for knowing everyone's secrets, for having connections that extended beyond the school walls, and for remembering both favors and slights with equal clarity. Students came to her with problems, seeking her advice or intervention, and she dispensed both with the wisdom of someone who understood that information was the most valuable currency in high school. But Madison's true talent lay in her ability to identify threats before they materialized. She could spot a potential rival from across a crowded hallway, recognizing the subtle signs that indicated someone who might challenge the established order. It was this instinct that had first drawn her attention to Emma Rodriguez during second period, when she'd noticed the new girl observing rather than participating, watching the social dynamics with the kind of analytical attention that suggested intelligence and strategy. Most new students fell into predictable patterns. They either tried too hard to fit in, making themselves vulnerable to manipulation, or they isolated themselves completely, becoming irrelevant to the school's social ecosystem. But Emma Rodriguez was doing something different. She was studying them, and that made her dangerous in ways that Madison couldn't yet fully articulate. During lunch, Madison made her rounds with the practiced efficiency of a politician working a room. She complimented Sarah Mitchell on her new haircut, knowing that Sarah's insecurity about her appearance would make the attention memorable. She asked Jake Wilson about his upcoming wrestling match, demonstrating the kind of personal knowledge that made students feel seen, while also reminding them that she paid attention to their lives. She offered to help coordinate the fundraiser for the drama department, positioning herself as indispensable to the school's social fabric. But even as she performed these social rituals, Madison's attention kept drifting to the corner table where Emma Rodriguez sat alone, methodically eating a sandwich while reading a paperback novel. There was something unsettling about the new girl's composure, the way she seemed perfectly content with her own company, while still remaining aware of everything happening around her. Most students who sat alone did so out of necessity or social anxiety, but Emma's solitude seemed like a choice, which made it infinitely more intriguing. Chloe had already begun gathering intelligence, reporting that Emma was from Phoenix, that her father worked at the lumber company, and that she'd transferred in the middle of the semester due to family circumstances. The basic facts painted a picture of economic instability and social displacement, exactly the kind of vulnerability that Madison typically exploited. But something about Emma's demeanor suggested that she wasn't as fragile as her circumstances might indicate. Ashley had attempted casual conversation with Emma during their shared chemistry class, employing the friendly interrogation techniques that usually yielded comprehensive information about new students within 48 hours of their arrival. But Emma had deflected Ashley's questions with polite responses that revealed nothing significant, answering direct inquiries while volunteering no additional details. It was a level of social sophistication that Ashley found both frustrating and impressive. The more Madison observed Emma Rodriguez, the more convinced she became that the new girl represented a potential disruption to the carefully balanced ecosystem she'd spent years constructing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Emma didn't seek attention, but she commanded it simply by being herself. She didn't try to impress anyone, which somehow made her more impressive. She didn't participate in the social games that occupied most students' energy, which gave her a kind of power that existed outside the established rules. Madison had built her reputation on being able to predict and control social dynamics, but Emma Rodriguez represented an unknown variable in an equation she thought she'd mastered. The new girl's presence created questions that Madison couldn't answer, and questions were dangerous things in an environment where certainty was power. As the lunch period drew to a close, Madison made a decision that would set events in motion far beyond what she could anticipate. Emma Rodriguez needed to be tested, her boundaries explored, and her weaknesses identified. If she proved to be harmless, she could be dismissed as irrelevant. If she proved to be a threat, she would need to be neutralized before she could upset the delicate balance that Madison had worked so hard to maintain. The plan that began forming in Madison's mind was elegant in its simplicity, designed to reveal Emma's true nature while also sending a clear message about the consequences of challenging established authority. What Madison didn't realize was that her instincts about Emma Rodriguez were absolutely correct, but she had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the threat the new girl represented. Emma's alarm buzzed at 5:30 in the morning, the same time she'd been waking up for the past 4 years. The habit was so ingrained that her body responded before her mind fully processed the sound, her feet hitting the cold hardwood floor of her new bedroom before she'd even opened her eyes. Completely. The room was sparse compared to her old one in Phoenix, containing only the essentials they'd been able to fit in the moving truck: a twin bed with a faded blue comforter, a small dresser her father had painted white to hide the scratches, and a desk she'd assembled herself using instructions that were missing half the pictures. The house they'd rented on Maple Street was a far cry from their suburban home in Arizona. Built in the 1960s, it had the kind of character that real estate agents called charming and renters called expensive to heat. The kitchen linoleum was cracked in several places. The bathroom faucet had a persistent drip that her father kept promising to fix, and the living room carpet bore the ghostly outlines of furniture arrangements from previous tenants. But it was theirs, at least for the next year, and Emma's mother had already begun the process of making it feel like home with strategically placed throw pillows and the family photos that had survived the cross-country journey. Emma pulled on her running clothes in the darkness, careful not to wake her parents who were still adjusting to her father's new work schedule at Morrison Lumber. The job required him to be on site by 7, which meant he'd been going to bed earlier and rising before dawn to review the safety protocols that came with operating heavy machinery. Her mother had found part-time work at the local library, a position that paid less than her previous job at the Phoenix Public Library System, but offered the kind of stability they desperately needed after months of uncertainty. The morning air in Cedar Falls carried a crisp bite that Emma was still learning to appreciate. Unlike the dry heat of Arizona, the Pacific Northwest cold felt alive, filled with moisture that seemed to penetrate her clothing and settle into her bones. She stretched on the front porch, her muscles responding with the memory of countless early mornings, spent preparing for training sessions that had shaped not just her body, but her entire approach to challenge and adversity. Emma's running route took her through the residential neighborhoods that surrounded Riverside High, past houses where her new classmates were probably still sleeping peacefully in bedrooms, decorated with posters of pop stars and college pennants. She'd mapped out a 3-mile circuit that included a steep hill section, designed to maintain the cardiovascular conditioning she'd built over years of competitive athletics. The rhythm of her footsteps on the pavement created a meditative cadence that helped organize her thoughts for the day ahead. As she ran, Emma allowed her mind to drift back to the wrestling facility in Phoenix where she'd spent so many hours that the place had felt like a second home. Coach Martinez had been more than an instructor. She'd been a mentor who understood that wrestling was about far more than physical technique. The sport demanded mental discipline, strategic thinking, and the kind of emotional control that served athletes long after they left the mat. Coach Martinez had recognized something special in Emma from their first training session, a combination of natural ability and fierce determination that couldn't be taught. The wrestling room had been Emma's sanctuary during the difficult years, when her father's employment had become increasingly unstable. While other teenagers were dealing with typical adolescent drama, Emma was learning to channel frustration and anger into productive physical expression. The discipline required for competitive wrestling had given structure to her life when everything else felt chaotic, and the confidence she'd gained from succeeding in such a demanding sport had carried over into every other aspect of her existence. Emma had earned her place on the varsity team as a sophomore, an accomplishment that required not just skill, but the respect of older athletes who didn't automatically accept underclassmen. She'd competed in tournaments across the Southwest, collecting medals and trophies that represented thousands of hours of training and sacrifice. By her junior year, she'd become the wrestler that coaches from other schools specifically prepared their athletes to face, her reputation spreading through the competitive circuit like a carefully guarded secret. The Arizona State Championship had been the pinnacle of her wrestling career, a tournament that attracted the best high school athletes from across the region. Emma had entered the competition as a third seed, underestimated by opponents who judged her based on her quiet demeanor rather than her technical abilities. She'd advanced through the brackets with a combination of strategy and power that surprised even her own coaches, winning matches that established her as a serious contender for the state title. The final match had been against defending champion Jessica Morales, a senior who'd been wrestling since elementary school and had already committed to a Division I university program. The gymnasium had been packed with scouts, coaches, and families, the kind of crowd that could either energize or intimidate, depending on an athlete's mental preparation. Emma had entered that match carrying the weight of her family's financial struggles, her father's job search, and her own uncertain future, but she'd also carried the confidence that came from knowing she'd prepared for exactly this moment. When the referee raised Emma's hand in victory, signaling her triumph in the state championship match, the emotion that overwhelmed her wasn't just about wrestling. It was about proving to herself that she could excel despite circumstances, that dedication and hard work could overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable. The gold medal she'd earned that day represented more than athletic achievement. It symbolized her ability to persevere through adversity and emerge stronger. But that was Phoenix, and this was Cedar Falls, where nobody knew about Emma Rodriguez's wrestling accomplishments or understood the discipline that had shaped her character. Here, she was just a new girl whose family had moved from Arizona, another student trying to navigate the complicated social landscape of a small-town high school. Emma had made the conscious decision not to mention her wrestling background, partly because Riverside High didn't have a girls' wrestling program, and partly because she wanted to establish her identity based on who she was now, rather than what she'd achieved in the past. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd gone from being a celebrated athlete to being virtually invisible, but Emma understood that sometimes anonymity was a strategic advantage. She could observe and adapt without the pressure of living up to established expectations, could choose her battles rather than having them chosen for her. The skills she'd developed on the wrestling mat translated perfectly to social situations. That required patience, timing, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. As Emma completed her morning run and headed back toward Maple Street, she caught sight of the school bus that would carry her to another day at Riverside High. Her stomach tightened with the familiar mixture of anticipation and caution that had accompanied every new beginning in her life. She had no way of knowing that this particular day would test every lesson she'd learned about resilience, strategy, and the importance of choosing when to reveal your true strength. The social architecture of Riverside High revealed itself to Emma through careful observation during her first week of classes. Every high school operated according to unwritten rules that governed everything from where students sat during lunch to which bathrooms were considered acceptable to use between periods. Emma had learned to decode these systems quickly, understanding that survival in any new environment depended on recognizing power structures before accidentally violating them. Madison Parker's influence extended far beyond her immediate circle of friends, reaching into every corner of the school's social ecosystem through a network of relationships that had been cultivated over years of strategic alliance building. She served on the student council, not because she cared about school governance, But because the position provided access to information and decision-making processes that affected student life, her name appeared on the volunteer lists for every major school event, from homecoming planning committees to charity drives, positioning her as indispensable to the administration while also demonstrating her commitment to school spirit. Teachers treated Madison with the kind of respect typically reserved for adults, recognizing that her cooperation could make their classroom management significantly easier, while her opposition could create complications that extended far beyond individual lesson plans. She had mastered the art of being helpful without being obsequious, offering assistance that positioned her as a leader while also creating obligations that others felt compelled to reciprocate. When new policies were implemented or changes were being considered, administrators often sought her input, understanding that student buy-in was essential for successful implementation. Emma observed these dynamics with the analytical approach she'd learned from competitive athletics, where understanding your opponent's strengths and weaknesses was essential for developing effective strategy. Madison Parker wasn't just popular in the traditional sense. She was influential in ways that made her genuinely powerful within the microcosm of high school society. She had created a system where challenging her authority would require not just courage, but also careful planning and significant social capital. Chloe Bennett served as Madison's primary intelligence gatherer, possessing an almost supernatural ability to collect and analyze information about their fellow students. She maintained active social media accounts across multiple platforms, following the digital lives of hundreds of classmates and tracking the subtle shifts in relationships, loyalties, and reputations that occurred in online spaces. Chloe could tell you who was dating whom before the couples themselves had made their relationships official, which students were struggling academically based on their stress posting patterns, and whose family situations had changed based on shifts in their lifestyle indicators. Her talent for gathering information was matched by her skill in deploying it strategically. Chloe never gossiped in the obvious sense, never spread rumors that could be traced back to her directly. Instead, she asked questions that prompted others to reveal information they hadn't intended to share, made observations that guided conversations toward topics she wanted to explore, and offered seemingly innocent comments that planted seeds of doubt or curiosity in receptive minds. She was the friend who remembered every detail you'd ever shared with her, and the enemy who could weaponize your vulnerabilities with surgical precision. Ashley Cruz brought a different kind of asset to their triumvirate, possessing the social charisma that made people want to please her and the emotional intelligence to understand exactly which psychological buttons to press for maximum effect. She could deliver compliments that felt genuine while simultaneously highlighting the very insecurities they were supposed to address, offer helpful advice that subtly undermined confidence, and express concern for people's well-being in ways that made them question their own judgment. Ashley's cruelty was always wrapped in apparent kindness, making it difficult for targets to articulate exactly what had been done to them. Together, the three girls had created a social machine that operated with frightening efficiency. They identified potential threats to their status, gathered intelligence about those individuals, and neutralized challenges before they could fully materialize. Students who might have emerged as alternative leaders found themselves dealing with mysterious social obstacles that seemed to arise from nowhere. Friendships dissolved over misunderstandings that appeared accidental, but followed suspiciously consistent patterns. Academic achievements were overshadowed by personal scandals that emerged at precisely the wrong moments. Emma's presence at Riverside High represented exactly the kind of unknown variable that their system was designed to eliminate. She possessed qualities that could potentially challenge the established order, intelligence that wasn't immediately obvious, confidence that didn't require external validation, and a self-sufficiency that suggested she wouldn't be easily manipulated through traditional social pressure. More concerning was her apparent indifference to the hierarchy they had worked so hard to establish, treating Madison and her friends with polite respect rather than the deference they expected from new students. The decision to test Emma's resilience wasn't made impulsively, but rather evolved through a series of subtle provocations, designed to gauge her responses to increasing levels of social pressure. It began with small things, Chloe asking pointed questions about Emma's previous school and family situation, Ashley offering backhanded compliments about Emma's clothing choices and academic performance, Madison making observations about Emma's social isolation that were phrased as concern, but carried clear implications about her status within the school community. Emma's responses to these initial probes were frustratingly neutral, neither defensive enough to indicate vulnerability, nor aggressive enough to justify escalation. She answered personal questions with polite but vague responses that revealed nothing substantial, accepted compliments graciously without engaging in the competitive comparisons that usually followed such exchanges, and acknowledged observations about her social situation without displaying the embarrassment or defensiveness they expected. Her composure under pressure suggested either remarkable emotional maturity or concerning indifference to their opinions, both of which posed challenges to their established methods of control. The planning for what would become known as the glue incident began during a seemingly casual conversation in Madison's bedroom on a Friday afternoon. Her parents were attending a wine-tasting event at the country club, leaving the house available for the kind of private discussion that required absolute confidentiality. Ashley and Chloe had been invited for what Madison described as a strategy session, though the specific nature of the strategy hadn't been revealed until they were settled in the comfort of Madison's carefully curated personal space. Madison's bedroom reflected her personality with disturbing accuracy, everything perfectly arranged to create an impression of effortless elegance while actually requiring constant maintenance and careful curation. The color scheme was sophisticated neutral tones, accented with carefully chosen metallic elements. The furniture was expensive enough to signal status without being ostentatious, and the decorative elements suggested interests and activities that positioned her as both approachable and aspirational. Even her bookshelf had been arranged to display titles that suggested intellectual depth while avoiding anything too challenging or controversial. The conversation that followed was conducted with the kind of casual cruelty that characterized their approach to social warfare, discussing Emma Rodriguez as if she were a problem to be solved rather than a person to be understood. They analyzed her behavior patterns, speculated about her psychological weaknesses, and debated various strategies for establishing their dominance over her social situation. The glue prank emerged from this discussion as an elegant solution that would accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously. It would create a public humiliation that would establish Emma's position in the social hierarchy, provide entertainment for their followers, and demonstrate the consequences of failing to show proper respect for established authority. What they failed to consider was the possibility that Emma Rodriguez might respond to their provocation in ways that fell completely outside their experience and expectations. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that made Emma's breath visible as she walked from the bus stop to Riverside High's main entrance. The autumn leaves crunched beneath her worn sneakers, their golden and crimson colors creating a natural carpet that reminded her of the changing seasons she'd never really experienced in Phoenix's perpetual desert climate. She pulled her gray hoodie tighter around her shoulders, the fabric still carrying the faint scent of the lavender detergent her mother used to make their limited wardrobe last longer between laundry days. Emma's routine had become as predictable as clockwork over the past 3 weeks at her new school. She arrived at 7:45, exactly 15 minutes before first period began, giving herself enough time to navigate the hallways without rushing, while also avoiding the pre-class social interactions that seemed to consume so much of her classmates' energy. Her backpack contained everything she needed for the day, organized with the same methodical precision She'd learned from years of preparing for wrestling tournaments where forgetting a single piece of equipment could derail months of preparation. The morning progressed exactly as it had every day since her arrival at Riverside High, first period American history with Mrs. Patterson, where Emma continued her strategy of sitting near the back and contributing just enough to class discussions to avoid being labeled as disengaged while not drawing excessive attention to her academic abilities. Second period advanced mathematics with Mr. Kim, where her natural aptitude for numbers made her stand out despite her attempts to remain invisible, earning her nods of approval from the teacher and curious glances from classmates who were beginning to recognize her intellectual capabilities. As the bell signaled the end of second period, Emma gathered her materials with the same efficient movements she'd perfected over years of quick transitions between activities. Her third period advanced chemistry class was located in room 247, a specialized laboratory space that required students to follow strict safety protocols and maintain assigned seating arrangements. The walk from the mathematics wing to the science building typically took her exactly 3 minutes, a timing she'd calculated during her first week to ensure punctual arrival without appearing overeager. What Emma couldn't have known was that her predictable schedule had been carefully studied and analyzed by individuals who viewed her routine as an opportunity rather than simply a behavioral pattern. Madison Parker had spent considerable time mapping Emma's movements throughout the school, noting not just where she went, but when she went there, how long she stayed, and which routes she preferred for moving between locations. This information had been compiled with the thoroughness of a military intelligence operation, creating a comprehensive profile that would enable precise timing of the plan they had been developing. The industrial adhesive that would soon change everything about Emma's morning sat innocuously in Madison's designer leather backpack, disguised among textbooks and school supplies in a small container that Chloe had obtained from her father's construction company. The adhesive was specifically designed for permanent installations, the kind of chemical compound that created unbreakable bonds between materials and required professional-grade solvents or mechanical removal to separate. Its clear, odorless consistency made it perfect for covert application, and its rapid setting time ensured that once contact was made, escape would be impossible without outside intervention. Madison had volunteered for early morning laboratory setup duty in Mr. Peterson's chemistry class, a gesture of academic enthusiasm that the teacher had accepted gratefully. The extra credit opportunity provided her with unsupervised access to room 247 for 15 minutes before other students began arriving, creating the perfect window for implementing the plan she had been crafting for days. She moved through the laboratory space with practiced efficiency, her movements casual enough to avoid suspicion from anyone who might observe her through the classroom windows while still accomplishing the task that would transform an ordinary Tuesday into something far more memorable. The application process required precision and timing that Madison had rehearsed mentally multiple times. Emma's assigned seat was located at the third laboratory station in the second row, a position that provided clear sightlines from multiple angles while also ensuring that any incident would be visible to the maximum number of potential witnesses. Madison spread the adhesive across the chair's seat with smooth, even strokes, ensuring complete coverage while maintaining the appearance of an unaltered surface. The chemical would remain workable for approximately 10 minutes before beginning to set, creating a narrow window that required perfect timing to execute successfully. Chloe had positioned herself strategically for the morning's events, arriving at room 247 earlier than usual and claiming a seat that provided optimal viewing angles for both observation and recording. Her phone was already configured for video capture, the recording application hidden behind what appeared to be note-taking software in case any teachers happened to notice her device usage. She had also taken the precaution of alerting several classmates that something interesting might happen during chemistry class, creating an audience primed for entertainment without revealing specific details that could be traced back to their planning. Ashley's role in the morning's operation was equally crucial but more subtle. She had spent the previous evening strategically mentioning to various social media contacts that Tuesday might be an eventful day at Riverside High, creating anticipation without providing specifics that could implicate her in whatever occurred. Her posts and messages were carefully crafted to seem like casual observations about school life, while actually priming her network to pay attention to whatever content might emerge from the day's activities. Emma entered room 247 at precisely 7:57, exactly as she had every day since joining Mr. Peterson's advanced chemistry class. She exchanged polite nods with several classmates who had begun acknowledging her presence, placed her backpack in its usual position beside her laboratory station, and settled into her assigned chair with the same methodical approach she brought to every aspect of her academic routine. The adhesive was at the perfect stage of its chemical process, soft enough to allow comfortable initial contact while rapidly bonding with the fabric of her jeans. The sensation of sitting down felt completely normal at first, the adhesive's consistency allowing her to settle into position without any indication that something was wrong. Emma opened her chemistry notebook and began reviewing the previous day's notes on molecular structures, unaware that she was now physically connected to her chair through chemical bonds that were strengthening with each passing second. The adhesive continued its curing process, transitioning from a workable compound to an unbreakable connection that would require significant force or chemical intervention to dissolve. Mr. Peterson began the day's lesson with his characteristic enthusiasm, launching into an explanation of intermolecular forces and chemical bonding that provided unintentional irony for those who understood what was happening in his classroom. He drew complex diagrams on the whiteboard, illustrating how different molecular structures created permanent connections between materials, his academic passion for chemistry, creating an educational backdrop for the very real demonstration of adhesive bonding that was taking place just a few feet away from his desk. Emma's first indication that something was amiss came approximately 10 minutes into the class period, when she attempted to shift her position to get a better view of the whiteboard diagrams. The resistance she felt was subtle at first, just enough to make her pause and reconsider her movement without triggering immediate alarm. She tested the sensation again, applying slightly more pressure to determine whether she had simply caught her clothing on some protrusion from the chair or if something more significant was occurring. The realization that she was physically stuck to her chair came gradually rather than as a sudden shock. Emma's wrestling background had taught her to assess unexpected situations calmly and analytically, treating surprises as problems to be solved rather than crises to be panicked about. She tested her range of motion carefully, confirming that her jeans were firmly adhered to the chair surface with a strength that indicated intentional sabotage rather than accidental spillage of classroom materials. Around her, Emma began to sense a shift in the classroom atmosphere that suggested her predicament was not as private as she had initially hoped. Conversations carried undertones of anticipation. Electronic devices glowed with active screens despite the school's policy against phone usage during class time, and the general energy in the room indicated that her fellow students were aware that something unusual was developing. The attention felt familiar in some ways, reminiscent of the moments before wrestling matches when spectators sensed that they were about to witness something significant. Madison watched Emma's growing awareness with satisfaction, noting how the new girl's posture changed as she recognized the extent of her situation. The plan was unfolding exactly as anticipated, creating the kind of public spectacle that would establish Emma's position in the school's social hierarchy while providing entertainment for their audience. Madison felt the particular pleasure that comes from successful execution of a complex strategy, the satisfaction of seeing careful planning translate into desired results. Chloe had begun recording the moment Emma first tested her mobility, capturing every subtle expression and movement as the realization of her situation dawned. The footage would provide lasting documentation of Emma's humiliation, creating content that could be shared across social media platforms to ensure that the incident's impact extended far beyond the physical confines of room 247. The video quality was excellent despite the covert nature of the recording, positioning and lighting combining to create clear images that would reproduce well across various digital formats. Ashley maintained her position as a seemingly innocent observer, her expression reflecting curiosity rather than anticipation in case anyone later questioned her involvement in the morning's events. She had mastered the art of being present for dramatic incidents without appearing to have any prior knowledge of their likelihood, a skill that had served her well during previous social operations. Her role would become more active later when the content generated from Emma's predicament needed to be distributed strategically across their social network. The moment of full revelation came when Mr. Peterson paused his lecture to ask students to move their chairs into discussion groups for a collaborative activity on chemical bonding applications. The instruction created immediate movement throughout the classroom as students rearranged their seating arrangements, but Emma remained motionless at her laboratory station. Her stillness created a ripple of awareness that spread through the room like a wave, drawing attention from classmates who were beginning to realize that something significant was happening. Emma looked down at her situation with an expression that surprised everyone who was watching carefully. Instead of the panic or embarrassment that her tormentors had expected and hoped for, her face showed something closer to resignation mixed with analytical curiosity. She examined the chemical bond that connected her clothing to the chair with the same methodical attention she might give to a complex problem set, her approach treating the situation as a puzzle to be understood rather than a catastrophe to be endured. "It appears I'm unable to move from my chair," she announced to the classroom, her voice carrying none of the shame or distress that Madison had anticipated. The simple statement created a moment of complete silence before nervous laughter began rippling through the room. Students began clustering around Emma's laboratory station, their initial amusement giving way to genuine curiosity about how such a situation could have occurred in their chemistry classroom. Mr. Peterson turned from the whiteboard to discover his carefully organized classroom in a state of barely controlled chaos, with students abandoning their assigned activities to investigate the unusual situation that had developed at Emma's station. His confusion was genuine and complete as he approached, trying to understand how one of his most reliable and well-behaved students had somehow become physically attached to her chair during what should have been a routine lesson on molecular bonding. Emma's explanation of her predicament was delivered with clinical detachment that impressed even those who had come to witness her humiliation. She described the sensation of being bonded to the chair without expressing outrage about the obvious sabotage, avoiding accusations that might escalate the situation into something that could result in administrative involvement. Her composure under circumstances that should have been deeply embarrassing demonstrated a level of emotional control that exceeded what most people could manage under similar conditions. The teacher's initial attempts to resolve the situation involved various classroom chemicals and solvents that proved completely ineffective against the industrial strength adhesive. Each failed attempt created additional spectacle as Mr. Peterson became increasingly frustrated with his inability to free one of his students from furniture that had somehow become weaponized against her. Other students offered suggestions ranging from helpful to ridiculous, creating a cacophony of voices that transformed the classroom into something resembling a problem-solving collaborative rather than a chemistry lesson. Emma endured the extended attention with remarkable patience, answering questions about her condition matter-of-factly, while allowing adults and classmates to work around her without complaint. She maintained her dignity despite being the center of a situation that was rapidly becoming legendary. her grace under pressure earning respect from observers, who had expected to witness a breakdown rather than a demonstration of character. The prolonged nature of the spectacle meant that word of the incident was spreading throughout the school via text messages and social media posts, creating an audience that extended far beyond room 247. The arrival of the school nurse followed by the assistant principal and eventually the custodial staff, transformed Emma's personal crisis into an institutional emergency that required coordination between multiple departments. Each new adult who entered the situation brought additional expertise, but also additional witnesses to Emma's predicament, expanding the scope of her public humiliation while also increasing the likelihood that the incident would be thoroughly documented in official school records. When it became clear that freeing Emma would require cutting away the affected portion of her genes, she accepted this solution with the same calm pragmatism she had demonstrated throughout the entire ordeal. The scissors used for the procedure were medical-grade instruments borrowed from the nurse's office, their sharp edges easily separating fabric that had been chemically bonded to the chair surface. The resulting damage to her clothing was significant, enough to expose portions of her legs that she would normally keep covered, adding another layer of embarrassment to an already humiliating situation. The physical evidence of the sabotage remained visible on both the chair and the pieces of fabric that had been cut away, creating clear proof that Emma's situation had been the result of deliberate action rather than accidental exposure to classroom chemicals. The adhesive residue would require professional cleaning to remove completely, ensuring that room 247 would carry physical reminders of the morning's events for weeks to come. Emma examined the chemical evidence with scientific curiosity, her analytical mind processing the information even as she dealt with the immediate practical consequences of the attack. As Emma finally stood free from the chair, wrapped in a borrowed shirt that reached mid-thigh to preserve her modesty, while she waited for replacement clothing from the school's emergency supply, something subtle but significant shifted in her demeanor. The analytical calm remained firmly in place, but underneath it, careful observers might have detected a different quality emerging. It wasn't anger exactly, and it certainly wasn't embarrassment, but rather a kind of focused attention that suggested Emma Rodriguez was no longer content to remain invisible at Riverside High. The walk to the nurse's office for proper clothing replacement became another gauntlet of attention as word of the incident spread throughout the school. Students lined the hallways to catch glimpses of the girl who had been glued to her chair, some offering sympathy while others barely concealed their amusement at her predicament. Emma navigated this attention with the same composed dignity she had maintained throughout the entire ordeal, neither seeking sympathy nor displaying the kind of victimization that might have satisfied her tormentors. Madison watched Emma's departure from room 247 with feelings that were more complex than the simple satisfaction she had anticipated. The plan had been executed flawlessly, creating exactly the kind of public spectacle they had designed to establish Emma's position in the school's social hierarchy. Yet something about Emma's response felt wrong, too controlled and strategic for someone who was supposed to be learning her place through humiliation. The new girl had handled a situation that should have broken her composure with a level of grace that suggested either exceptional emotional maturity or experience with adversity that Madison hadn't considered. The realization that Emma Rodriguez might be more than she appeared created new questions that Madison found deeply unsettling. Students who could maintain dignity under such circumstances possessed qualities that made them dangerous to established power structures, and Emma's response suggested reserves of strength that had not been fully revealed. The successful prank had accomplished its immediate objectives, but might have awakened something in its target that could prove problematic for future operations. As the final bell of third period rang and students began transitioning to their next classes, the story of Emma's chemical imprisonment was already spreading through digital networks that connected Riverside High to the broader community. videos recorded during the incident were being edited and uploaded to social media platforms, creating permanent documentation of Emma's humiliation that would outlast the physical evidence left behind in room 247. The incident had achieved the viral potential that Madison had hoped for, ensuring that Emma's reputation would be defined by this moment of vulnerability. But as Emma walked toward the nurse's office to complete her recovery from the morning's ordeal, her mind was already processing lessons that her tormentors couldn't have anticipated. The attack had revealed important information about the social dynamics at Riverside High, identifying threats that she had suspected but not confirmed, and demonstrating the lengths to which certain individuals would go to maintain their positions of power. More importantly, it had provided her with justification for responses that she might not have considered appropriate under different circumstances. The girl who had been glued to her chair was the same Emma Rodriguez who had entered room 247 that morning, but she was also something more. The incident had stripped away the last vestiges of her attempts to remain invisible, forcing her into a visibility that would make future anonymity impossible. If she was going to be noticed regardless of her preferences, then she would have to decide what kind of attention she wanted to attract, and what kind of reputation she was willing to build at Riverside High. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.